So if you could this morning, turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 3. In preparing, I actually went through about 3 different lessons in a matter of 2 days that I decided to do. And I couldn't get out of my head the idea of really excuses. Camp obviously is a pretty pivotal week for really everybody involved. For those who have gone, you understand that you go away to camp, we take the phones, it's a very kind of, everything is revolved around the Word. You get up in the morning, you have what they call God and I time, your devotional. You go to breakfast, you have moments where you talk with your counselor, both one-on-one and in a group setting about the God and I times, the devotional that you're going through. You have 2 different chapels during the day, one in the morning and then one in the evening. And then they have kind of free time throughout the day where they can kind of go off, do whatever they want, and enjoy just really no supervision for the most part. And during that time in particular, they have the opportunity, the counselors go one-on-one with them. They meet one-on-one. A lot of it's generic questions, and some of it is more probing, trying to get an idea of kind of where they're at in their spiritual walk. Is there anywhere we can kind of improve on? And ultimately, in preparation, I couldn't help but think through just the idea of excuses. We tend to have a bad habit of using excuses. Now, that applies to more than just our spiritual walk. I couldn't tell you how many times you all probably have asked me to do something, and I told you I didn't have time. And I probably did. I just didn't want to help, right? We use excuses all the time, okay? So in particular today, I'd like to look at Moses. In chapter 3, we're going to start the reading in verse 7. But in particular, I think it's important that we look at the first 6 verses just to make sure we get a background here. So quick run through. Ultimately, you're introduced to Moses, beginning of the chapter. He is in the field watching over the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, okay? In doing so, obviously, he's watching them. He kind of takes them to the back of the field, the back of the property, if you want to call it whatever, and it kind of leads into the mountain of God on the back of this property. He gets there, and upon arriving to this mountain of God, an angel of the Lord descends the presence into this burning bush. We're all pretty familiar, I think, with the story. Moses then kind of turns his attention away from the flock, the Bible says, and acknowledges the bush and says he's going to turn his attention to it, ultimately. God then steps in and then begins kind of explaining what we would know to be the story. In particular, I'd like to look at really 3 particular aspects of the story. So starting in verse 7, if you have your Bibles, Exodus chapter 3, verse 7, "And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. For I know their sorrows. So I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of my children of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come now therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Moses said to God, But who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? So he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, Indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Moreover, God said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the children of Israel, The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations. Okay, so first and foremost, the obvious is you see Moses' calling. In verse 10, God directly comes out and says, Come now therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So the calling. right, ironically, and I didn't know this until we went back last year. Last year was our first year actually taking the youth and the juniors to Camp Kobiak. We got to camp, and I told Corinne pulling into the camp, like, this looks really familiar. I had actually gone there as a I think it was middle schooler, 7th, 8th grade time frame in my life. We only went there one year. The youth group I went to was massive, about 125 kids on a normal Sunday, Wednesday, and to camp, I mean, we've had like a Croswell bus that we crammed full of kids. Huge group, right? And so we went to this camp. It's a kind of a smaller camp. At the time, we were meeting where the juniors actually have chapel. We weren't even going down to the other building that's much bigger. To make a long story short, ultimately pulling in, walking the facility, we were walking, you pull up, and then to your right are kind of the cabins that all of the juniors would stay at, and then to the left is kind of where you have like the dining hall, the junior chapel is there now, there's kind of some different areas you can kind of hang out. And in walking down that way, I looked at Corinne and I said, oh my gosh, this is where I remember being on the side of the building, like I pointed right at the place and said, that is exactly where I was when I felt the Lord calling me to ministry. I thought that was going to be paid, but that's okay. I'm not going to complain. Either way, my point is, I made a decision. In this moment, I felt the Lord. We had spent the whole week at camp, and Thursday night is kind of the home run message that a lot of the speakers give. I believe at the time it was Tom Pettit, if you know the name. He spoke a great message about surrendering your life to the Lord and wanting to serve Him in all aspects and all these kind of different things. And I just remember sitting there. It was that, maybe you've experienced it, those moments where you know there are people around you, but it was like I was the only one there. And it almost felt like Tom Pettit was kind of like inserting my name into everything he was talking about. Every sentence seemed like he was talking like, Chris, you should do this, Chris. And it just was, I don't know, it was a very like direct message where I felt very called out. In a good way. Not like I was doing something wrong, just I felt like the Lord was calling me into ministry, and specifically youth. That's kind of what is happening here in verse 10. Moses is getting a calling directly from God. He's speaking with him. And to that point, if you jump back to verse 7, you look at it, and the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. I thought it was interesting when God said, I know their sorrows. So in doing some digging, the best analogy or example to compare it to is kind of like we all probably have had a moment where your friend, somebody you deeply care about, is not directly family. This friend loses a very close loved one. Maybe it's their parent, maybe it's their grandparent, whatever the case may be. It's not somebody that you directly know. It's somebody that you care about knows very well. And when this friend comes to you, inevitably what tends to happen is they are grieving. They're hurting, they're sad, and you have a lot of empathy, sympathy towards them. You have an element, you almost feel their pain. Obviously, you don't know this particular person who has passed away, and yet you still feel that grieving loss because you know that the pain that they are going through. This is the level where it talks about the Lord knows their sorrow. Obviously, he wasn't down with them. He wasn't under oppression, but they're his people. He loves them. He cares for them. And so in hearing their cries for as long as they had been in oppression, inevitably, he got to the point where enough was enough, and he could no longer take it. So he comes down to Moses, right? Follow that up with Moses' response, okay? And I think this is a valid question, to be honest with you. Moses in verse 11 comes out and says, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? So God tells him to go to Pharaoh, deliver my people, and Moses' response is basically like, I'm not really qualified for that. I'm just a normal person. I'm just an individual. I don't really have any like high-ranking authority. It's not like the people of Israel were rallying behind him to be this big leader and relying on him to do that. It was kind of just the Lord called him, and that was it. And so Moses' response is kind of like, why me? I don't really see any particular reason. To that point, the only kind of logical, I'm a very logical person, okay? Everything has to kind of make sense. And so in doing some background work, the logical reason you use Moses in my head, if you remember backtracking the story of Moses, Pharaoh had called to kill all of the children at the time. His mother puts him in the basket, floats him down the river, and wouldn't you know it, who finds him? Somebody from Pharaoh's, basically like where he lives. So Moses is kind of raised underneath, not directly below Pharaoh, but he gets kind of a first-hand witness to see how things are operating. Seems like that would be somebody who you'd probably want to help lead, somebody who was like an inside man almost. But nonetheless, Moses comes back and says, well, I'm not really qualified. I don't really understand why you called me. What's interesting is God's response to Moses' question is a complete disregard of the question. He doesn't answer it. I mean, if you look in verse 12. So he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So Moses says, God, why am I qualified? Why did you call me? I don't understand. And God says, well, I'll be with you. I almost, kind of reading between the lines here maybe a little bit, get the sense, you know when you ask somebody a question and they don't answer, and yet you have a very strong sense of where they stand on the question? I almost get the feeling when Moses asks God, hey, listen, I'm not qualified, why'd you call me? God's thinking, yep, not qualified, you're right, but it's okay, I'll be with you, is what he says. I'll be with you, and he doubles down and not only says, I'll be with you, but the exact place you are standing. What will happen is you'll bring these people out, you'll deliver them from Egypt, and inevitably where you'll bring them to is exactly where you're standing. Exactly where you're standing will be this sign and a place where you will later worship, knowing that I delivered you out of exile, okay? Out of captivity. Now, that's not the end, because unfortunately, Moses kind of has this back and forth for really about a chapter and a half, going back and forth with God. So then you jump to verse 13. Then Moses said to God, indeed, when I come to the children of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? I was a little confused reading this. Again, my logical brain, a bush is on fire, somebody is speaking inside of the bush and says, come save my children of Israel. If it was me, I'd like to believe I'd go, probably God. Seems like the logical deduction there. I don't know many bushes that were on fire being spoken through, let alone referencing his people, right? Seems odd. And so I was kind of doing some digging to why would Moses ask that question? Seems silly. Well, there's really two reasons, okay? One, and I don't know that I'm all the way sold on this one yet, but it's a possibility. Obviously, the Israelites had been in captivity for a very long period of time. The thought process is that maybe being under the Egyptian captivity for so long, they were polytheistic. They had many gods, they believed in many different people, and so there's a possibility that the Israelites, in being in captivity for so long, kind of lost the, I guess, religion, if you want to call it that they had, and maybe the idea of like a God was almost foreign to them potentially. Again, I don't know that I'm all the way sold on that, because the second option is something that, full transparency, I do. When I was a kid, let me rephrase. I still do this. I can't try to pawn this off when I was younger. So I'm pretty good at reading people. Usually, I can tell when people are going through something, hurting. It's obvious when there's people that wear their emotions on their sleeves. You can always kind of tell then. But inevitably, there are people who are really good at hiding it. And even those people, there's usually some small, like, kind of telltale signs you can kind of pick up on. And I've, for whatever reason, always kind of been pretty good at that. I don't really know why. To that point, in being able to read people, that's the good part of being able to read people. The bad part of being able to read people is I was pretty, I guess I was again, I am pretty good at knowing how, I don't really know how to say it, manipulate, I guess. I'm really good at knowing how to make it look like I'm doing something when I don't want to do it and inevitably make you do it. So let me explain. High school, obviously you deal with a lot of group projects. You're all probably familiar at some point dealing with a group setting. I would always find the one individual who I knew thought it was life or death that they had to get an A. That was number one. Find the person that knew they needed an A, because they're going to take it real serious, and they're going to make sure they get an A no matter what. Then what would happen is in the group setting, in the very beginning stages, we would meet, and there would be an element of, okay, you do this, I'm going to do this part, you do this, and then we'll bring it all together and kind of, in one, like towards the end, put it together and then be able to present, okay? I get my task, okay, great, no big deal, I got it, no problem. Well, I'd give it about a day or two, I'd go home, and then come back and be like, I started, and I had a couple questions. I didn't know what you meant by this, so can you just kind of give me some insight on what you're really looking for here? Okay, sure, great, no problem. So they gave me some insight. Okay, great, I got it, I'll go home. That night I go home, I'm not feeling this. Go back the next day, and then I find a couple more specific questions. I'm like, okay, you told me to do this, I got it, but then there's like 4 or 5 different directions I can go with it, so then I don't know if you want me to do that, and then we're having this conversation where I just kind of like, I'm asking very vague questions with the intent that inevitably the end result every time, without, and don't do this. Kids that are in school, please. I'm not advocating for this. Inevitably what would happen is the person that would be so adamant on getting an A would get really frustrated that I was incompetent and then would just take the work. I didn't have to do any of it. So then I'd go up there and I'd speak and I'd do, this is what I did part of my project. And I didn't do anything, right? I get the sense that this is what Moses is doing here. Oh, who are you speaking? Well, I think he knew. I think what Moses is doing here is he's trying to play dumb, hope that God, if he asks enough questions, that God will kind of be like, nah, forget it. I'll find somebody else. Somebody else has got to be willing, right? No big deal. You and I have the foresight to know that he's dealing with the Lord. That was never an option. The Lord was going to use him whether he wanted to or not. But ultimately, I believe that's what Moses is trying to do here. He's trying to finagle his way out of this, ultimately. Right? So you see that in verse 13. In verse 14, God responds, once again. God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent you to me. Moreover, God said to Moses, thus you shall say to the children of Israel, the Lord of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial to all generations. So God responds, I am who I am the one God, the one true God, right? That's the obvious part of verse 14. Verse 15, again, I had some questions. What's the significance of laying out the fathers? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. What's the significance there? Ironically, so I started prepping this lesson the week before camp, knowing that camp was going to be pretty crazy, and I didn't know what kind of time I'd have, so I tried to do a lot of it beforehand. And ironically, when we were at camp, the youth speaker, he was talking about 2 Kings. A little bit of background in 2 Kings. Ultimately what happens is there's a period where Israel's kind of split into 2 nations, northern, southern, and they have a span of, I don't remember the exact number, like 25 different kings between the 2. And I think between the 2, out of the 25, there's like 3 that the Bible says were good in the sight of the Lord, and all of the other ones say they were evil in the sight of the Lord. To that point, when he's talking through these kings and their reign in 2 Kings, he mentioned that there was a particular character, Josiah. Josiah was one of the few good kings who reigned at the time, and he gave a big, long lesson about it. But ultimately, the reason I bring it up, Josiah, when you read 2 Kings, and you read the part about Josiah, it says his father was David. But that's not true. The way Kings is set up is it's very almost chronological, I guess. You jump back like two chapters, and you'll see a king, Manasseh. And Manasseh was one of the ones that did evil in the sight of the Lord. And in that chapter, it lists, and his sons were so-and-so, so-and-so, and Josiah. Okay, so then why does Josiah's chapter refer back to David? Well, the youth speaker mentioned that the way the Old Testament was written was they tended to use that as a comparison. Okay? David is thought to be good. Man after God's own heart. I don't think we really got to break that down too much. So when you talk about Josiah, the Bible traces him back to David, which is true. He's a part of that lineage. It's just much further. Instead of Manasseh, because Manasseh was not a good king. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. And so to that point, here, part of the reason he's mentioning the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, all of them had shortcomings. It's not a secret. Really, everybody in the Bible did. I don't really know many characters other than Jesus, to be honest with you. But to that point, they all had these shortcomings. And nonetheless, they still were looked at, especially by these Israelites, as kind of the forefathers of the faith. They're kind of Abraham gets that covenant when you track it all the way back. And then the covenant's passed down from Abraham to Isaac, his son. And then from Isaac to Jacob, his son. And then from Jacob to it just kind of keeps going down the line. So that's kind of why it references here the fathers. It's an idea that the Lord's saying, listen, these were good people. Do what I'm telling you, and you're following the Lord. You're serving him. You're seeking him. I'm asking you to do something, so just, do it. The issue here is you continue to see a pattern with Moses where we've looked at two. There are three more examples of him basically making excuses. Just quickly, you saw verse 11. He said, "Who am I? I'm not qualified. Why me?" Verse 13, Moses said, "Indeed, but who do I tell him you are?" What's your name? Who do I tell him? Jump over to chapter 4 really quick. Look at verse 1. God, after verse 13, goes through 9 verses of kind of explaining who he is. Moses' response in verse 1 of chapter 4, Moses answered and said, "But suppose they will not believe me, or listen to my voice. Suppose they say, the Lord has not appeared to you." So now he says, "Okay, God, I know who you are. That's great, but I'm going to go to these people, and then they're going to say, I don't believe you." Okay, there's excuse number 3. Then you see a long list of another 9 verses of God explaining, it'll be okay. I'm sending you for a reason. They're going to believe you. Jump down to verse 10. Then Moses said to the Lord, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither before me nor since you have spoken to me or to your servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." This is probably the one, in my opinion, legitimate excuse that Moses gives. It's believed Moses had some sort of speech impediment. Maybe it was a stutter. Doesn't come out directly say, but ultimately, he had some sort of speech impediment. Placing myself in his shoes, if I was somebody who was not well-spoken, somebody who struggled to speak as it is, I don't know that I want to go to the king of the people who are keeping me captive and say, "Let me go." Seems like a surefire way to not ever leave that place, because you're probably going to die or go to prison or something. That's probably the one excuse that he gives that I can look at and be like, okay, that's fair. I get why you're asking that. Nonetheless, the Lord responds and basically tells him in the next several verses that he could have called somebody else, but he didn't. He chose Moses. My favorite one, verse 13. But he said, Moses, "O my Lord, please send the hand of whoever else you may send." So now he comes back and just says, "God, I just don't want to do it. I don't. Pick somebody else, please." He's run out of options. There's no other excuses he can give. He played his cards. He laid them all on the table, and ultimately nothing worked. Like I said, the one, I think, legitimate excuse he had was, "I stutter. I can't speak well. How am I supposed to go in front of him?" And the Lord kind of brushed it off and said, "I chose you for a reason." And in doing so, he's got nothing left. I don't want to do it. Just pick somebody else. Problem here is Moses, we all know the story. God gets very angry at him. Moses kind of tucks tail and then begins to do what the Lord had finally asked him to do at this point, if you were to read the rest of the chapter. These excuses Moses gave were not something that he was willing to die on the hill for. These excuses were not something that prevented him from being used by the Lord. These excuses didn't turn around and inevitably make the Lord choose somebody else, which I don't know how you feel about the butterfly effect, but if you want to go down that road, if Moses doesn't do it, does anybody else down the faith happen? Does the Lord pick somebody? I'm not getting into that. My point is just, it's a very murky situation. And Moses understood that the Lord was calling him. He tried, it didn't work, but he tried to get out of it. There are quite a few characters in the Bible that I think had very legitimate excuses. Quickly, let's just go through a couple of them. So we talked about Moses, right? He has a speech impediment. Let's just use that baseline one to say that was his one legitimate excuse. Joseph, abducted into slavery, abused by his brothers, abused by Potiphar's wife, abused by the other prisoners in the prison. Samson was a womanizer. Jacob was a cheater. Gideon was afraid. Job lost literally everything, and the Lord let it happen. Noah was a drunk. Peter denied Christ not once, 3 times. David, a man after God's own heart, has an inappropriate relationship with the woman, and then in doing so turns around, kills her husband, ruining the relationship he has with this woman and now the child. And then maybe the greatest of all, Paul. His job was killing Christians. What he did. I feel like those are pretty legitimate excuses. To turn around and the Lord say, I want to use you. Ooh, I kill people. I don't really know that that's who you want, Lord. See, the problem is these people had legitimate excuses. And they continue to serve. They continue to seek God. They continue to live the faith and do great things. Paul's believed to be arguably one of the best evangelists ever, if not definitely the Bible time. He killed people. Where the problem lies is our excuses are, I was too tired to get up for church in the morning. I had a big week, a lot of business meetings. I had a big project due at work, so I'm just going to kind of mail it in this week, and I'll do better next week. Ironically, again, in writing this lesson, this message, I had talked about the idea of tomorrow, the idea of again, I'll use myself as an example. I have a bad habit of telling myself I'm going to begin something next week. Usually what happens is I look in the mirror and think, ooh, I'm getting a little pudgy on the sides here, so I need to hit the gym. Got to get back in shape, okay? It'll be like Wednesday, Thursday, and it's like, well, I'm halfway through the week. I got the weekend coming up. I was going to hang out with my friends, so I'll do it Monday. Monday will be a good starting point. I get to do what I want this week. It'll be my last hurrah. I'll get to enjoy it, and then I'll move on, and then Monday, I'll do it. Well, problem there is I told myself that in January. It is July, tomorrow. So I haven't done any of that. But we have a problem doing that. I think it's not, hopefully, just me. I'd like to believe I think we all have a problem with that. We tend to tell ourselves that tomorrow we're going to get to it. Tomorrow we're going to do something. We set this expectation. We set aside whatever. We meal prep for our meals, and then you do it for a week, and that was hard. I got busy, didn't do it. Oops. Back to square one. I don't know how valid our excuses are. One of the main ones I think Corinne and I hear, well, maybe not yet, but we heard it for a while in being young adults who were single. Our youth group dynamic at the moment is relatively young. None of them, I don't think, are at this stage quite yet, but at some point it's probably coming. Inevitably, when you start getting eyes for somebody else, you get into a relationship, you have this mutual interest in somebody, and what happens is obviously you want to spend time with them. Not a secret. For those who are married, I would hope that that's what you guys did. You spent time with your significant other. You talked to them when you could. You sacrificed hanging out with friends or doing the dumb stuff or whatever, playing video games, whatever it is, right? To get to know this other individual, right? Point being, I heard it quite a bit through high school and my young adult age. Corinne heard it quite a bit, and I've heard several of our youth talk about it. The excuse you get when you are interested in somebody. What happens is you begin texting. That's what they do now. They text all day, and inevitably what happens is the first couple weeks, it's nonstop. The moment you get a message, you're responding. The moment they get the message, they're responding. It's fun, it's exciting, it's brand new, whatever, right? And couple weeks, what tends to happen is one individual will begin to not respond immediately, but it's kind of like every 4 or 5 hours. What happens, though, is the individual who was still interested now begins this process of overthinking, oh my gosh, they no longer like me. They didn't respond in 4 minutes, so they don't like me anymore, right? Not wrong, though, because what tends to happen is this 4 or 5 hours of no response turns into a couple days worth of no response, turns into a couple weeks worth of no response. And every time you ask that individual, hey, everything okay? I haven't heard from you in a while. Every time, without fail. You know what the response is? Sorry, I was busy. Sorry, I was in the middle of something. Sorry, my family was doing something. We had a big trip. Like, what, did you go to Africa? Why did you have a service? I don't understand. People, it's hilarious not being in it anymore, not having to deal with it. You look at what happens, and it just doesn't make sense. People are like, oh, sorry, I was vacationing in Florida. And you're like, that's great. You didn't scroll through your phone for 5 minutes once? Like, that doesn't make sense. But what happens is you get this response of, I'm too busy. And then fill in the blank with whatever the busy excuse was, right? The problem is they were making time to do what they wanted to do. They weren't too busy to go hang out with their friends and go to the mall or play some sport. They weren't too busy to take this vacation and literally do nothing on the beach but lay out under the sun and get a tan. You make time, and you probably all said this to somebody at some point. You make time for what you care about. It's not a secret. Again, there's a problem with that statement because we're not making time for the Lord. We don't. We blow it off. Shoot. I like doing my devotions in the morning. It's 5 o'clock now. I'll just do it tomorrow. I don't like doing it at night. Shoot. It's the weekend. I forgot again. I'll just blow it off. I'll get to it Monday. Start fresh on the new week and hit the ground running, right? Again, we're 6 months in. I'm not a big advocate of New Year's resolutions. You tend to set this really high expectation and then never meet it. But I do like setting goals. I like setting an expectation that, okay, I'm not going to be perfect, but I'd like to reach this goal. Making something reasonable. I mean, everybody does it, I think, to some degree. But again, we're now almost 7 months away from whatever goal you probably made. How are you doing? Great? I don't know. If you are, props to you, because I am not. If you're not doing so good, follow-up question. When was the last time you even thought about it? We tend to make these goals. We do really good for, the first month and a half, 2 months, and then we fall off the horse and, shoot, kind of get back up, and then you're kind of walking with a crutch, not doing it so great, but you're doing it some. It's better than nothing. And then by the time April rolls around, whatever that goal was is shot. You hadn't thought about it in weeks. And at this point, it's probably been months. That's what happened to me with planning this. It was really eye-opening. I was doing this and thinking like, whoop, I am not doing so good. We make excuses, plain and simple. And the problem here is the excuses we make, I don't think compare to the excuses these people had in the Bible where they were literally killing Christians. And yet it didn't stop them. They still did it. Closing thoughts. This week at camp, again, it's always a rejuvenating week, both for the youth and like I said, I'm a kid. Let's be honest. I like running around. I like goofing off. I'm inappropriate with my bathroom humor, probably more than I should be. I'll be honest. I like hanging out. And every time I've gone to camp, I leave there feeling like, man, I can't wait to serve the Lord. I surrender my life. I just want to do what he wants. I want to do this great stuff for him. And a lot of you that went to camp probably experienced the same thing at some point. You made this decision. I want to serve God. I want to do what you want. Show me, and I'll do it. One of the last days, the speaker brought out an extension cord, specifically a power strip, right? And he had talked about how he would, he has his printer plugged in. He talked about his computer being plugged in his office. He always has a phone charger because nowadays you always have to kind of carry one with you and all this other stuff. And he said the issue was when he set up his room, he looked around and he liked his desk in the middle of the room. He liked being able to kind of free roam all the way around him, get whatever he needed to out of his cabinets or people coming in. They could talk, sit wherever, go wherever, no big deal. And what happened was that power strip was under his desk, and it's got about a 3-foot-long cord, and the wall was about 8 feet away. So he said he had a genius idea. He took that power cord, and he just plugged it in. Genius. Unlimited power. Well, no, it doesn't work like that, right? Can't plug into itself. It doesn't have any power source. He used that as an example to say the problem is we leave spiritually on fire and say, yes, God, I want to be served. I want to seek you. I want to do what you want. I just show me what you have and I'll do it. And then we plug into ourselves and we walk away instead of plugging into the power source. We don't plug into God. We don't rely on him. We don't let him lead. We don't let him guide. He tells us things to do, and then we kind of, not feeling it, so I'll do it later. It's been so bad before, I've even used, I don't know if, again, maybe I'm just telling on myself in front of a lot of people, and so that's great, it is what it is. But I've gotten to the point before where I felt the Lord calling me to do something, and in my mind, genuinely thought, somebody else will do it. That's not my problem. They'll get to it. If God really wants it to happen, he'll take care of it. He'll get somebody to do it. That's a pretty dangerous statement. You're not wrong. I mean, maybe the Lord is going to make it work still, but I don't really know that I want to roll the dice on that one. I get to look him in the eyes someday, and he gets to ask me, hey, why didn't you do that? I don't know that my response of, because I didn't feel like it's going to go very well. Point is, we make excuses. I encourage you today, a lot of the youth made some significant decisions to surrender their lives this week. I'm not trying to put them on a pedestal and say, be like them. But at the same time, they made some decisions. Corinne and I are going to do all we can to kind of walk alongside and help them reach whatever they're trying to strive for, but we can't make it happen, obviously. Make decisions. Serve the Lord. Seek him. Let him guide. Because your excuse of, I was busy, I doubt it. You really want to tell the Lord you were too busy for him someday? Good luck. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Like I said, I'm very logical. I'd like to not. I never liked being in trouble either. That was kind of the other part. I was the kid that my friends would go ding-dong ditch other people's houses, and I was always kind of afraid to go with them. They would go, and I'd start running before they even got to the door, just because I didn't want to get caught. Maybe it's just me. But ultimately, whether it's in your spiritual life, or even if this is just some motivational, get back to working out, get to your diet, whatever you want to use it as, your excuses probably don't have a lot of weight, a lot of value.